And good evening. Welcome to Continual. And this is Hot Off the Press, where we talk about new releases and the authors behind them. And so tonight I have with me John Hartness, David Coe, and the one and only AJ Hartley. So I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves, and then let's have a little bit of fun talking about the new releases. AJ, I'm going to let you go first.
Okay, thank you. I'm AJ Hartley. I write mystery, thriller, fantasy, and science fiction for various age groups. I also write as Andrew Hart. That's just domestic. That's sort of realist thrillers. And I am the Robinson Professor of Shakespeare at UNC Charlotte.
David?
Hi, I am David B. Coe. I also write as D.B. Jackson. I write epic fantasy, urban fantasy, historical, some media stuff, yeah, that's pretty much it. I have a new book out, and we'll be talking about it tonight. I'm very excited about it.
And John?
I'm John Hartness. I am the founder and publisher of Falstaff Books. I also write the Bubba the Monster Hunter series, the Quincy Harker Demon Hunter series, and pretty much whatever else strikes my fancy. And I feel somehow inadequate that I only write under one name. So I think I got to work on that. That'll be my fourth quarter project, is come up with a pseudonym. It is somehow
I have one, but I
derived
do have
from
all my curse words right in the name.
Chuck Tingle's taken.
One that's somehow derived from the initials or root name of my actual name.
So let's talk a little bit. Let's start picking on some of the new releases here. So AJ, you've got this one called Impervious. We know it tied a little bit back to some personal experience, and since the publisher is on top of you right now, we'll go first with that one.
Whoa. We're keeping this PG-13.
You're in the screen above him.
Yeah, so Impervious, it's a little tricky to talk about in a sort of light, cheery, bubbly kind of way, as these things tend to be. So I apologize in advance for bringing the rain cloud. This is a book, a version of which I'd been thinking about for a number of years. A fantasy adventure, sort of Buffy the Vampire Slayer-esque story. And the idea was that in the course of the story, a lot of the fantasy components would break down, and you'd start to realize that something else was going on, that it was a much more conventional, real situation, a very traumatic event. And as I say, I'd been thinking about it for a while, but hadn't committed to it. And then I was in a school shooting a little over a year ago at UNC Charlotte. And I wrote this as a kind of coping mechanism, as a sort of strategy for coming through the experience, because as you can imagine, it was traumatic. It was more traumatic than I realized initially. It took me a few days to sort of figure out that I needed to write something, which is what I usually do when something's stressful or difficult. So, I mean, it's a little longer than novella. I think it's a low 50,000 words. But I wrote it in 13 days, the first draft, just without doing anything else, just sort of eating and sleeping and writing and getting it done. It took a lot longer than that to then sort of shape up and edit and find a home for it and do the final copy edits and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, it was I usually write to a structured model. With this, it just kind of came out because it had to come out.
And so it's been out for a while now. Have you found that getting it out, talking about the story, talking about the process has helped you now kind of get past the incident, or at least help to process it better?
Yeah, I mean, almost problematically so, that in some ways the incident has now become a story. And I think it came out in late April, right, John?
Yeah, it came
So
out
it's been out.
last week of April.
Yeah, so it's been out a couple of months, a little bit more, and the UK edition came out just a couple of weeks ago, and I think the difficulty at the moment, as I'm sure everybody would say, with new releases, is that while we're not supposed to talk about the current unpleasantness, or rather the versions thereof, because there are multiple unpleasantnesses going on at the moment. But the one thing they all have in common is that they make it incredibly difficult to crack any kind of news cycle. And so I think, getting attention for new books is really, really difficult. So while I feel like I'm talking about this book all the time, part of the frustration is still kind of like the initial frustration when, a couple of days after the shooting, I found that I'd be at the grocery store and I would have this overwhelming desire to take people physically out of the building because they didn't understand how much danger they were in, which was a really strange feeling. But there's a part of me still feels like that. And now, instead of trying to take them out of the building, I'm trying to get them to read this book.
Well, let's hop over. So, David, let's talk about, and of course, I just went blank on the name.
Time's Assassin.
Time's Assassin.
Of the Islevale cycle.
Yeah. Well, let me start. I want to start by saying that I blurbed Impervious for AJ and was happy to do it. And it's a brilliant book and it's a really important read. And I think everybody ought to take a look at it because it's a really, really powerful story.
I'm going to be really interested to,
and then I'll be happy to talk about me.
I want to be really interested to see my niece's class's reaction to Impervious, because she teaches high school senior English.
Oh yeah.
And I just sent her a few copies because she wanted books for the back of the room. And I said, I know a guy.
If they need somebody to Skype in and talk about it or something, I'd be happy to do it.
Awesome. I'll let her know. Sorry, David.
No problem at all. It's a book that needs more attention. And so too is Time's Assassin.
Which is
Time's Assassin.
It is not 50,000 words.
No, it is not 50,000 words. It laughed as it went past 50,000 words in a blur.
That was the author
on its way to
right?
140,000 words.
That's like 3 books, man.
Yeah, I know. So Time's Assassin is the third and final volume of an epic fantasy time travel series called the Islevale Cycle. And it takes place in another world. It's got lots of castle intrigue and action and magic and stuff like that. But the basic idea of it is there are these time walkers, people who can go back in time. But for every day they travel back in time, for every year they travel back in time, for every decade they travel back in time, they age that amount. And then if they want to come back to their own time, they age that much again. So my lead characters are 15 years old and they go back in time 14 years and they arrive in the past in the bodies of grown-ups, but they're still teenagers emotionally and intellectually, and they are thrown far, far beyond their depth into a situation where they're having to care for and guard and protect the infant heir to a royal house. The story just takes on from there. And of course, with the third volume in the series, I'm tying up lots of loose ends. There's lots of stuff going on, lots of subplots and threads and everything that I'm weaving together. Third books are hard in a trilogy because you're always trying to make sure that you get every thread just right. Third books in time travel are mind-blowingly difficult because there are so many threads and so many time factors to deal with, and the paradoxes are multiplying. And I have one character who shows up, I think there are 4 iterations of her in the book, John, 4 or 5?
At least.
At least. So
I did the layout for Times Assassin because I do the interior layout for everything we publish. And I had to keep the Word document open to make sure when it was the same day again and again in different places. I'm like, is this right? Or did something Nope. That's right.
It is the most ambitious thing I've ever written. And I knew it was ambitious from the start, but I think it's also the best work I've ever done. I am really proud of this trilogy. It was impossible to write. I never want to write time travel again, but I'm so glad I did it once.
The thing I really like about the way you handle time travel in this series, David, is that there are consequences that aren't just the paradoxes. Because we've seen that a million times. We've seen, you go back and your mom falls in love with you and then suddenly you disappear from the family photos, or all of a sudden your wife doesn't know you, Barry Allen. But this idea of aging for every moment you move in time, that gave you something really interesting to watch you mine that through the series, because those consequences, that going in as one of your walkers, that this is what's gonna happen, and right. I got to do it anyway.
Right.
Where'd you come
and
up with
there's a lot about how we use people and how we the sacrifices we ask of people and the different circumstances under which somebody is being told you have to give up years of your life to do something. And there are people who do it voluntarily and there are people who are forced to do it. And those dynamics were interesting to deal with. They really were. So thank you, John. I appreciate that.
It's a great idea because, time travel is like magic. It seems like it gives you the sort of ultimate escape clause to every story, right? And the way that you're doing it there makes the cost of that magic, so to speak, really, really clear and weighty
and inescapable.
Right, and that's exactly the point. Because if you don't, as you say, time travel takes over. Everything has a mulligan. If you can just go back in time anytime you want to, no plot point is etched in stone. And so, quite apart from what it does for my world, as a writer, it drives you up a freaking wall. And so you want to be able to prevent your characters from messing with your story. And this was the way for me to do that.
So when you're doing that with the kids that start out as this in the story and having to progress both the body and the biological factors of that, the body of somebody who's 30 is very different from the body of a teenager. And then you still do the Freaky Friday. I'm going to shove the personality and the thought processes of a teenager into that. That's got to be a bit traumatic and something fun to play with.
Yes, it was. And part of it was having the kid was important, because I remember when I had, especially our first daughter, that Nance and I both felt like, we're just kids ourselves. What the hell are we doing trying to bring this life into the world and bring her up and be mature on her behalf? And so there was very much this sense of living out that anxiety through my characters by really making them kids having to take care of kids. But yeah, there's all sorts of stuff like that. And my characters, they go through some stuff. It's not an easy journey for them at all. And the ending was particularly heart-wrenching to write. So
John, you've got a couple of different collections coming out here, anthologies, stacks of stuff.
So because I'm late with all of my personal deliverables this year, the things that I have that are new are anthologies that I have stories in. I went several years without doing any anthology work. And then I guess 2018, 2019, multiple people came in and said, hey, will you do a story for this? Sure. Hey, will you do a story for this? Sure. And then I turn around and I've got 6 anthologies coming out within the span of 12 months. I'm like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Wait a minute. Why can't we do like 2 a year? That would be fun. But no. So Predators and Petticoats, this is a story that is set in the same universe and uses the same protagonist as my novel Amazing Grace. And this anthology, which is edited by Emily Leverett and Margaret McGraw, this all features female protagonists kicking ass and taking names, basically. The idea behind it was it was 2 women putting together a book about awesome women, full of stories about awesome women. And there are some awesome men and women in this book with me. R.S. Belcher is in there, Natanya Barron's in there, Jeannie Adams, Susan and Clay Griffith, Shannon McGuire, Jody Lynn Nye, Kat Rambo, as well as some debut authors. So it's a really nice book, and the cover came out looking really good. So this is available now in print and ebook. Then Zombies Need Brains does a set of anthologies every year.
Yeah.
Yep.
And this was my first time being asked to participate in one of these, and I was in the one called My Battery is Low and It is Getting Dark, which is this one. And it all started from the transmission from the Mars rover that said exactly that. So all of these stories are about tech that has lived past its life or shouldn't be working anymore and mysteriously is again. So this story it's a little bit of my homage to Jonathan Mayberry's Rotten Ruin series, because it is a far future story set in the Quincy Harker universe. So I got to jump my Quincy Harker character a couple 100 years into the future, which you get to do when you've got immortal protagonists. Now I just have to make sure I don't kill him in the series. So
That's what
the fans of that
for.
series now have a guarantee that I'm not killing him off. And then this is a anthology that David, you're in this too, aren't you?
I'm in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah. So this is a charity anthology that Baen Books published, and it is produced in honor of the passing of Timmy Bolgio, the founder of LibertyCon, and it's a whole bunch of people who have been guests and repeat guests and guests of honor and special guests of LibertyCon, and people that are considered to be part of the LibertyCon family. And it's David's in there, I'm in there, David Weber, David Drake. David is kind of a recurring theme in this book. Larry Correa, Chuck Gannon, Christopher Woods, Chris Kennedy, Mike Massa, Tim Zahn. It's a stack of people, and I think this is also a Harker story. I'm pretty sure this is a Harker story.
You can probably reach out to the author and ask.
Well, I could, if I had any faith that he would remember what story went in what book. Because no promises. So a lot of what I've been doing this year has been releasing short stories and working as a publisher. I am almost finished with the 7th book in the Quincy Harker series. That is the middle book of a story arc in that series. So I don't know the joy that David got to feel with Time's Assassin, because I've never finished a series. So I don't know what it's like.
You should try it.
Next year. I get to finish Black Knight next year with
There you
9.
go.
But this is the middle book in a 3-novel arc, and it's promising great changes in the Quincy Harker universe. So I expect it'll be out very early September. Hopefully. Maybe. It'll be out.
In 2020.
It'll be out. But these guys also each have other stuff. I mean, obviously, I want everyone to go out and buy Time's Assassin and Impervious because, well, I made those. I helped build those.
Yeah, I realized I should have books too, so I have mine too.
Yeah, I really just went to get them to show the comparison, because this book took me 3 hours to read the manuscript for. This one took considerably longer. Considerably.
So
I use bigger
now
words than AJ does.
yeah, well, now that we've let John talk, I'll mute him. So AJ, you have another little book out, which is continuing a series, Cathedrals of Glass, Valkyrus Wakes.
Yeah, so as you may know, I started a few years ago. I started working with Tom DeLonge, who's the lead singer of Blink-182 and Angels and Airwaves, and he got me on board to co-write with him a series called Secret Machines, which is sort of X-Files-y adult, and they are also massive books. I think I have David beat on that one. Those are like 700 pages. So, but at the same time, I also started doing. I pitched to Tom another book that I'd written called Cathedrals of Glass, which was a YA sci-fi. I call it YA sci-fi, but it's sort of suspense horror. It's typical of me. It's a sort of hybrid of various things that don't really belong together at all. And it's about a spaceship in a sort of dystopian world, a spaceship with 10 teenagers on who are being sent to a re-education facility on a neighboring moon. And they're in stasis, the ship goes off course, crash lands on this planet which is supposed to be deserted and isn't. And it's about, and the planet is this sort of frozen wilderness, but there's some kind of psychic presence there. And the first one is called Planet of Blood and Ice, and the second one, which just came out, is called Valkyrus Wakes. Valkyrus is the name of the planet. And as is often the case with when I do a series, each book is clearly tied to the rest of the books in the series, but each one has a tonal shift. It's a slightly different book. I think while the first one was more sort of straight sci-fi and horror, as close to horror as I get, this is more like psychological suspense, because the premise of the book is really that it connects to Impervious in a way, because it's another book where you don't really know what's actually going on. And that's the story of the book, as you try to figure out what's real and what's not.
David, so you've got another piece in another anthology called Galactic Stew.
Right, and actually, I'm an editor on Galactic
Oh yeah,
Stew.
that's right.
So this is my second editing venture. I'm sorry.
I said we just did a nice big release episode on that. Your editorial journey.
That's right.
In this one.
Yes. So that's right. So Galactic Stew is an anthology with stories that are all about food, and it's not just that somebody's at a meal and stuff happens. The food needs to be a central piece of the story, and we have it was a really fun project to work on. This is my second editing venture, working with Joshua Palmentier, who's the lead editor and owner of Zombies Need Brains. We had some really good writers in this. We have Esther Friesner in this, and Andy Duncan, R.S. Belcher, Jeannie Koch, and some new authors as well. And it's just, it's a really fun collection. And I really enjoy editing, as it turns out. Who knew? But I loved going through the stories. I even enjoyed reading the slush and finding those gems that we wanted to have in the final mix. I enjoyed working with all the authors. They were open to being edited and really cooperative, and just a fine bunch of people to work with. And Joshua is really fun, and just, he's been a terrific mentor for me. I've learned a lot about editing from him. So the first one we did together was called Temporarily Deactivated. And then Galactic Stew is the second, and we're launching the Kickstarter for the third set of Zombies Need Brains anthologies tomorrow. And we have 3 anthologies that we're trying to get funded, including one that I'm editing again with Joshua. And hopefully they'll fund. So keep an eye out for the Kickstarter.
Yeah, and in fact, we've got a special episode about to drop about that Kickstarter. And so that'll be airing, including the links for the Kickstarter. So that'll be out there, and we can probably get that to the links for this one as well.
Yeah, I really enjoyed working with Joshua on my story for Batteries.
So
yeah, he's a really fine editor.
So here's what I'd like to throw out on the table. Normally we kind of dive in, let's talk about the new books. And I think one of the really good themes that we've got here across most of this, excluding John, is we've got a lot of really strong, powerful, young adult topics going on here. And a lot of things where they're going through growth and experience from some very different ways. So when you're doing and creating like this, what do you want those readers to get out of that? Especially if you're trying to reach that teenage audience, that new adult, young adult audience, because where you're hitting on some of these really strong topics, where school is not a safe place that it used to be, where you're dealing with, kids and age and all of these sorts of things, where, how do you look at that? What are you really trying to get across to them when you're writing and trying to reach them as an audience?
AJ, why don't you take that one first? Because I don't really write YA.
I mean, I think some people, some YA authors, it's almost like they're following teenagers around and really trying to get into their speech patterns and the things that they're interested in, and the things that they talk about in a very immediate way. And I have a lot of respect for that, but it's not what I do. My YA novels are in many ways adult novels with younger protagonists, right? And that changes the nature of the story, because I think, as I think we've said before, I think part of the appeal of the YA novel, even to people who are older, is that there's a kind of urgency and intensity to the YA experience, because when you're growing up as whether you're 14, 15, 16, whatever, for a lot of things that you experience have never happened to you before. And you're trying to figure out who you are as a person and what kind of adult you want to be. And every friendship is the deepest friendship, and every betrayal is the worst kind of betrayal, right? And so there's this sense of everything is life and death, because part of what's happening is you're trying to sort of figure out what's important and what is of consequence and what's not. And it's like, one of the most humbling experiences you can do as an adult is read your teenage diary. Go back to whatever journal you kept when you were in high school, and it's horrifying. And you're like, who was this person? It's like, well, it's the person who was figuring out who they were going to be, right? So in that sense, I think writing a story that has a lot of sort of serious real world consequence is kind of built into the genre, right? There's a even when you're dealing with small stuff, there's a sort of implicit scale. Everything feels escalated. And as you said, we're deliberately embracing things that probably wouldn't have been written about in most YA literature 20 years ago, you know? So I think that what you have to do is not worry so much about what's the message, right? What do I want them to get out of it? So much as, how do I tell this story as truthfully as I can? How do I present these issues and ideas immediately and in a way that feels age appropriate, feels like it's not too off-putting or too alien to them, but not to worry too much about how do I deal with these big complex ideas for kids, because kids are wrestling with this stuff all the time anyway. You know, I think I mentioned once before, I saw there was an Amazon review of Impervious that said, you know, great story, but it's too mature to be a teen book. And you're like, but it's the teens who are getting shot in the schools. That's the point, right? So the issue is not, is the book too mature? The issue is, are we prepared candidly about big, scary things with the people who are experiencing them, you know? And if we're not, I don't know what we're doing. And I know, speaking to you guys, that you have a similar sensibility, that fantasy is not supposed to be exclusively escapist. Not for most of us, right? That we use fantasy to talk about things that we think are important. We're looking at it in a slightly different way. We're coming at it at a different angle, but it's not totally divorced from reality. I'm talking too much, so I'll float that.
No. One of the best pieces of advice, I worked on a middle grade thing many years ago that I still haven't done much with. I'd love to go back to it and work on it some more. But even writing the middle grade, when I was working on it, one thing that my agent said that really rang true to me was, don't write down to your audience. Don't speak down to them. Because the storytelling that works when you're writing for adults is the same storytelling that works when you're writing for any audience. And I think that's some of what you're getting at, except you're taking it a step farther, which is that we're always told, well, if you're going to write YA, you have to write to their interests. And it's like, no, in today's world, that doesn't stand anymore, because, you know, the planet's dying and that concerns all of us. People are getting shot and that concerns all of us. And we need to write the stories that we want to tell, that we want our audience to receive. And we just need to do it in a way that's true to the characters we're writing. And if we do that, it's going to appeal to a broader audience. The time travel books, which sound like they should be YA, are not YA. I didn't write them that way. I didn't intend them that way. I consider them adult fantasy novels. And there's some content, particularly in the second book, that's pretty racy, that I wouldn't have necessarily put into something originally had I thought of it as a YA. But the story is about coming of age. And I think that that's a story that appeals to many audiences. And actually, I have a YA piece that we're shopping right now that AJ has read at least a part of. And when I was writing that, I was writing for a YA audience, and yet, again, I was feeling as though I was writing the story that I wanted to write and not worrying about what the age group was of the reader I was going to try to appeal to.
I feel like that's what you have to do, though. I read a lot of stuff that is categorized as YA. I am several decades removed from being the Y in YA. And I may not have ever made it to the A part either, but a good story and good writing and well-executed craft is universal across your target age range. And it may be that you focus on different things and you cut some content, or you shift how you present some content because, okay, this book is targeted at middle grade, so perhaps we don't chop off quite as many heads or we don't describe it as closely. But it's still story. It's still got to be story.
Yeah. And I think, you know, some of this is also about one of the things that's happened since the internet is that the way we categorize stories has changed, right? I mean, we're less limited by the physical demarcations presented by a bricks and mortar bookstore, right? Where, you know, if I have a mystery and a fantasy novel, they're going to be in totally different parts of the store, and I may not be able to communicate with readers between those categories. But one of the things that that shopping online, and I think not just shopping, but thinking online, has created more hybridity, more subcategorization, more combination of things that didn't formally go together, in ways that have allowed for a greater flexibility in our approach to genre and to what we consider, you know, suitable for a certain kind of age group. I mean, you know, you pretty much anything in YA. It may limit which publishers are going to handle it. It may limit the kind of audience that you have, but I still think there's room for it in ways that there never used to be.
So do you think that means there's a lot more flexibility out there? I mean, I know if you're working from an indie perspective, you've got pretty much the flexibility to do anything you want to. But I mean, in your experience now where you're working with Falstaff, you're working with Tom DeLonge's enterprises, you're working with other publishers, are you finding to be a lot more freeing in terms of being able to write what you want and get the message across the way you want to?
Well, I think certainly, you know, this has been happening for a while, and John can speak to this as well as a publisher, because, you know, one of the books, the first book that I did with Falstaff was Act of Will and Willpower, which had both been originally released from Tor, but and they look kind of like epic high fantasy, but they're snarky and they've got a sort of slightly comic edge, and they're told from the perspective of a 18-year-old actor. Those books were originally submitted to Tor, among other people, 20 years before they were published, you know? And when they were first submitted, I remember distinctly the editor writing back to me and saying, we like this, but we don't know what shelf to put it on. We don't really know what it is. And the subtext was that, you know, fantasy has dwarves and elves and stuff in it, right? Because that was the kind of fantasy that most people read in those days. That it was epic high fantasy or kind of nothing, you know? And 20 years later, the same publishers who had rejected it suddenly wanted it. And not because the book was any better, the book was basically the same, but the market had changed, the market had evolved, and people thought of fantasy as a much broader and more flexible space than it had been 20, 30 years before.
Mm-hmm. From the publisher perspective, I have long said that small presses and indie presses and indie authors have had an almost insurmountable barrier to selling YA. And that is the direct school sales, the book fairs, the school visits, the bookstores, the return policy. I will be fascinated to watch the next 2 or 3 years in how YA goes to market and reaches customers, because everything is different now because of everything that we've gone through in 2020. We don't know what school visits are going to happen. We don't know what book fairs are going to happen. So the way and things, YA book sales have historically been seller driven, because the seller created the book fair, which got to the people. But now what we may see is a shift toward reader-driven purchasing of those stories, which then opens it up to presses of our size, indie authors, self-publishing, and being able to move significant numbers of YA titles. It's entirely possible that if we revisit this conversation in 3 years, the YA market will be dominated by self-published work. We just don't know, because if you think you understand publishing, sit down for 6 months. It'll all be different then.
Yeah.
And you know, we always used to say that the hard line between middle grade and YA was in part because younger children don't buy their own books, right? So they go to physical bookstores, or they go to libraries, or they get introduced to things at school, and then parents and teachers and librarians and various other sort of threshold guardians steer them in a certain way, and they're the ones who finally are paying the money to actually put books in their hand, whether those books are physical or electronic. But I think even that is changing. You know, it maybe not in terms of, you know, 8-year-olds having credit cards, but there's no question that those 8-year-olds all time in front of screens, browsing and things in ways that they were not just a couple of years ago, it seems to me.
And it absolutely is true that it may not be an 8-year-old, but the 12-year-old having access to their parents' Kindle Unlimited account is perfectly reasonable. The middle schooler who has access to your Amazon Prime Video account also will be able to pick up their phone, install an app, and read anything in your Kindle Unlimited account. So put your porn in a different Kindle Unlimited account, folks.
So to throw this out there, because I mean, I know I was reading well above my level starting very young. So I mean, I was reading, you know, things that would be typically regarded as adult books when I was probably way younger than I should have been reading them. But do you think that now, from a reader perspective, those who we see that are the hardcore readers are reading things at a much higher level than they would have been even like 10 years ago then?
I don't know that I have that kind of data, to be honest. My biggest concern, if I was honest, and I appreciate John's optimism about people reading more widely in a few years. My concern at the moment, especially with fantasy and sci-fi, is that one of the consequences of it becoming in some ways more mainstream in terms of fantasy and sci-fi finding its way into film and TV and such, that people are actually reading less, because what used to be a niche market has now gone mainstream, but it's now gone into those forms of story delivery which are frankly easier and more passive. So I don't know.
I haven't studied the market enough to know.
Yeah, the reading public has always been such a tiny percentage of the public at large. That I'm not sure I believe that the popularization of the genre and the creeping of the genre into visual media, that it's going to make that much of a difference. I think it's going to reach more people because it's available in that way, but I think that core of the reading public will remain as it has. And I think actually that what's happening is stuff that used to be, oh yeah, my kids read fantasy, my kids read science fiction, my kids read horror, has become, well, I read what my kids read because that's where some of the more interesting storytelling is going on. And so I think that the crossover between what mom and dad are reading and what Junior is reading has actually increased.
I hope you're right. Personally, I don't think so. I think there's a lot more sort of binging of Netflix in place of where we used to read. I mean, I think, the current unpleasantness has, in some ways, created what you would think would be the textbook conditions for an expansion in reading. And I don't think it has. I don't think that's what's happened.
Well, I'm not sure that the present unpleasantness is a good yardstick for that, because I know that actually I have found it very difficult to read since it began. My concentration isn't there. And I don't think that that's indicative of a permanent change in my habits, in the way I receive storytelling. I think it's something unique to this moment in history. And so I'm not sure that I take that as evidence of a broader trend.
I certainly hope that my scattershot concentration for the past 6 months is temporary, because I'm in the same boat,
Yeah.
David. I have trouble focusing for longer periods, for much more than 30 minutes at a time.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah.
My concern is this is going to be over, and maybe we'll look at the development of a new normal.
Yeah. Well, if there's a doom scenario, it's
well, we can go now. We're at the new normal, so we just.
You can always rely on me to bring the sunshine.
Yes. Are we allowed to say bollocks?
Why, yes, we are.
What he said.
Indeed.
Well, so I'm going to give everybody 2 minutes to give us some little ray of sunshine here, because I'm going to stretch AJ, so I'll let him go last. Let's find some little piece of hope we can give folks out there in the audience, that, for our creators out there that are looking to share their stories, whatever it is, what's the one thing you want to give them, especially during these challenging times, keeping focus and everything else?
I want to give them the knowledge that good story can and will still find a home. It is not easy. It has never been easy. But there are avenues and paths to publication and visibility that exist now that did not exist even 5 years ago. So if you are good at what you do and dedicated and stubborn, that's what saves you, David. Stubborn. Your story can get out there. I sent out contracts this week for 10 new novels that we're buying, 4 reprints and 6 brand new novels, and they're beginnings of 2 trilogies that will both be first novels for those authors. So we're reprinting 4 titles that are being rescued from another publisher, and we're kicking off 2 new trilogies with brand new novelists that are breaking in for the very first time right now in the middle of all of this. So it's always been hard. You can certainly listen to these guys talk about how much they had to work to get their agents, to sell their first book, how many books they had in the trunk before they sold their first book, all of those things. It's always been hard, but you can still get there. And you can also be Michael G. Williams, who toiled away for a decade writing vampire comedy and self-publishing, and then moving to publish with us. And last week won the Manly Wade Wellman Award for the best sci-fi novel written by a North Carolina author last year. So that is a fantastic achievement for him. It's a fantastic achievement for us as a press. I'm happy to say that there are only 2 people that have ever won that award that I don't publish. So there's your ray of, I'm your frickin' ray of sunshine.
We're so screwed.
Wow. And I would add to that regardless, I mean, as John said, the market is always tough in some way or another. For a long time, the big presses were buying more, but they were the only game in town. And so if you could land with a big press, great. But if you couldn't, you were kind of left out in the dark. That's not the case anymore. The big presses are harder to reach now, but there are many more avenues, and some of them are far more pleasant to work with than the big presses. What I would say, though, is there has never been a more important moment than this one for storytelling. And sometimes we write because we want to get what we want, what we're writing published, and sometimes we write because we have to tell the story. This is a time when we need to tell our stories. And I'm not just talking about, we're allowed to say the pandemic, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay, not just talking about the pandemic. There are lots of stories out there needing to be told right now. And they relate to race, they relate to ecology, they relate to politics, they relate to just the personal stuff that all of us are going through in a time of deep uncertainty. There has never been a more important moment for storytelling. And some of them will get published and some of them might not, but if you're writing, you're doing it because you need to get the story out. And sometimes that's just the most important thing.
All right, ray of sunshine.
I mean, I'm going to sort of basically straddle what you guys just said and say, yes, it's the incredibly important time to tell our stories. And yes, there are more venues available to us than there used to be. The other thing that I would add is that people are hungry for them. That there is an audience crying out for new stuff, whether that's, Netflix shows or whatever, but for story and for something that lifts us out of where we currently are, and helps us think about the things that matter to us, as David's saying, and the things that we need to think about, maybe some of which we haven't thought about enough in the past. And yeah, I think there are a lot of readers waiting for those stories, hungry for them. So is that a good thing? Yes, I think. If you write books, it is.
or create anything, for that matter.
Yeah.
Who lives, who dies, who tells your story?
Hopefully nobody I know. Well, I want to thank everybody.
There's the cloud.
So I want to thank all of you guys for joining us tonight on Hot Off the Press. Would you guys like to share where we can find you? And again, remind everybody of all those new Hot Off the Press releases. John?
You can go to www.falstaffbooks.com and you can order paperback copies of each of these new releases by these fine gentlemen who are sharing the screen with me tonight from that website.
And if you suck up enough, they might even send signed copies.
No, they really won't, because David lives too far away, and AJ might meet me somewhere for a pint, and
yeah. And you can find me here. That says ajhartley.net. And
yeah, it's really small, man.
Light on light blue, and you and I are both old, David. We can't read that.
But as John says, you can find my book, my most recent stuff, either at Falstaff, or with the case of the Cathedrals of Glass books at To the Stars, or on Amazon or any of the other usual suspects.
And you can find my stuff, that you can find the new book at Falstaff. I have a site, davidbco.com. I also have DB Jackson author, dbjackson-author.com. And And then Zombies Need Brains has a site as well, so you can find information about the anthologies there. Kickstarter starts on August 5th, which is before this is going to air, but it'll be going for a month. So when you see this, it should still be going on.
And I'm Jim Nettles. You can find me at jamespnettles.com. You can find me at authoressentials.net, and of course here at Continual. Thanks everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.